Welcome to my guide on how to assemble my G305 mod. This video is meant as instructions for people who have bought or are thinking of buying my model. I filmed this video when I was working on a prototype with holes, so the end result won't be the same as shown in this video, but the steps are the same on the final mod. Here you can see how my mouse buttons turn out after I've removed the supports. The mouse wheel has some built-in supports as well as some generated ones, which you have to remove. After you've removed the middle ones, you can just rip off the ring. The top hexagon has a ring around it built into the model. This aids with cooling and should be easy to pull off. There's also a small brim around the other side, which I also sand down. Next up, I mount the scroll wheel into the chuck of my drill. The scroll wheel should be about 7mm wide, so we need to remove some material. Here I'm pressing a small file against the side of the wheel while it's turning to get the size down. There's also a small brim around the other side, which I also sand down. If you later find that the middle click is too light, try sanding this side down more. Next up are the pegs that connect the mouse buttons to the shell. These are usually a little oversized from the printer, so a little filing is required. They need to be around 3mm wide and 1.5mm thick. I suggest to file the side that had supports underneath it, since this side is most likely to be oversized. The fit should be tight and not loose. Make sure there are no supports printed in the holes in the shell, since they are hard to remove and unnecessary. Next, we try to fit the bottom to the shell. Since I printed this with a brim, the bottom doesn't fit perfectly, so I'm going to use a file to take off a little material from the shell. These screw holes in the front usually need some filing as well, since they are used to clamp the front of the mouse together. If you notice a gap in the front of your mouse after assembly, it's a good idea to remove some material from there. I also pre-drill the holes in the bottom, 2mm in the front and back, and 1.5mm for the middle too. Here I'm removing some supports from the recessed area on the bottom which countersinks the screws. The goal is to have the screws be flush with the bottom. The holes in the shell also get pre-drilled, 1.5mm in the front and back and 1mm in the middle. Next, I recommend assembling the mouse without any electronics to make sanding easier. I start off with 240 grit sandpaper. Folding it in half makes it easier to sand around the USB port. Make sure to get some good wet sandpaper. PLA is especially hard to sand, and good sandpaper makes a ton of difference. I later bought some 3M Pro grade sandpaper and it worked a lot better than this generic brand. Also make sure to use wet sandpaper or a mask, since you don't want to breathe in this dust. Don't forget to clean up the holes for the side buttons with a file. This is how it looks after sanding with 240, 500, 800, 1200 and finally 2000 grit sandpaper. Finally, I use car polish and a microfiber cloth to polish the surface. Just keep going until you get the surface finish you're happy with. Now we get to the electronics. First, I remove the micro switch behind the scroll wheel. I use a piece of copper wire soldered across all three legs to heat them up at the same time. If you have a desoldering iron, this should be a lot easier. I heat up the copper wire whilst pulling on the micro switch from the other side. Then I clean up the PCB with some alcohol and a toothbrush, after which I get out the remaining solder with some solder wick. Here you can see the PCB with the microswitch removed. The scroll wheel is larger than the original one, so it sticks out from the shell enough. This however prevents it from fitting in the original PCB cutout, so we need to enlarge this. I'm using a small file to file away the marked areas. I'm trying to show you where to remove the material. If you hold the PCB in the right light, you're able to see the traces and where not to file. I file the front and back at an angle to remove as little material as possible. Just keep removing material until you get the scroll wheel to fit. You only need to solder wires to these two pads, voltage and ground. Make sure to solder the wires at a right angle so they don't interfere with the scroll wheel. Here you see me solder the orange wire on the bottom side of the white one. It should have been on the other side so it doesn't interfere with the scroll wheel. I then sand the bottom of the USB connectors so the glue has something to grab onto. I put CA glue on both sides and glue the connector in place against the standoff in the back. Here I fixed my mistake and soldered the orange wire in the correct orientation. I removed the wires from the left and right mouse buttons so I can shorten them later. Now it's time to install the PCB in the shell. Make sure to insert the on-off switch and place the PCB on top. Press the standoffs through the PCB and make sure it's sitting flat. Remove this foam light seal so it doesn't interfere with the battery holder later. Here I'm placing the battery holder. I later found out it's better to put in the battery first and put some tape around it before mounting it. It's also easier to put in the side button PCB before the battery holder so you can more easily plug in its connector. I plug in the connector for the left and right mouse buttons so I can cut them to length and resolder them. I then again have to remove the battery holder so I can route the wires underneath. So if you haven't found out yet, do the battery holder last. The negative battery spring goes towards the front of the mouse. I'm once again shortening the wires going to the terminals. After inserting the battery, it's a good time to test if everything is working as it should. After that, I can solder in the micro USB connector to the battery. The positive lead is towards the back of the mouse with this connector and battery. Here I'm trying to get a piece of tape around the battery so it's more secure, also something I should have done earlier. The side buttons slide into their slots and might need some adjusting with a file depending on your printer. Just make sure they're not rubbing on the shell. After those are in place, you should try fitting the two halves together. The shell grips around the bottom and then slides forward over the USB-C connector. The side buttons are a little too tight, which makes them click unintentionally, so I have to adjust them. I remove them from the shell and file off a little material from the actuator. Keep doing this until it feels right for you. After this, you can close the shell with 6 screws. The 2 middle ones should be the same as the ones used for the PCB. Then you can put the mouse buttons in their place and test if they click well. I've left the actuators a little long so there's room to adjust them. As you can see, mine are a little too tight, which doesn't let them spring back. So I take them out and sand them a little shorter until they feel how I like them to. Lastly, I have to install the mouse feet. These are G305 mouse feet and there are spots without holes in the bottom to place them. And there you go, a finished mouse ready to enjoy. Thanks for watching.